Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating, highly structured logical framework from the writings of Bediüzzaman Said Nursi. Specifically, we're diving into a section known as the 28th word. Now, if you're the kind of person who loves dissecting complex philosophical arguments and honestly seeing how surprisingly simple analogies can map perfectly onto massive cosmic concepts, well, you're absolutely going to love this. We're going to see how this text builds its argument, step by logical step, and really discover the incredible architecture behind its meaning. Okay, let's dive right into this. I want to begin with a bit of a thought experiment. Think about this. Does a prison exist because of the law, or does it exist because of the criminal? It's kind of like a chicken and egg scenario, right? To really grasp the philosophical mindset required to understand today's text, we have to hold this exact question in our minds. Normally, we think of a prison as just a building that sits empty, just waiting around for someone to break a rule. But the source material we're looking at today, it flips this entirely on its head. It proposes a fascinating model where the very existence of the punishment is actively generated by the defiance of the individual.
Section 1. Seeds of the Afterlife. Spiritual States.
So, to understand how the text actually arrives at this conclusion, it establishes its fundamental premise by contrasting belief and unbelief. And it does this using some really vivid botanical metaphors. It doesn't just frame these concepts as abstract thoughts, or tally marks on some giant moral ledger. Instead, it proposes that belief bears the seed of a sort of paradise, while unbelief conceals the seed of a sort of hell. By using this metaphor of a seed, the text is telling us that these spiritual states actually contain the inherent blueprint of their final destination. Think about it. A seed doesn't just arbitrarily turn into a tree. The tree is the necessary organic expansion of what was already packed inside that tiny seed. The afterlife in this specific framework is quite literally just the full blooming of an internal state. And that brings us to a really crucial point, captured perfectly in this quote from the text. The source material takes this seed metaphor to its absolute logical extreme. It asserts, just as unbelief is the reason for being sent to hell, so it is the cause of hell's existence and creation. Notice the subtle shift in language there? It's huge. Unbelief is not just the ticket that gets you sent to a pre-existing location. The text is actually arguing that unbelief is the generative cause of that location's creation in the first place. Without the unbelief, the necessity for the location wouldn't even exist. It's a profound shift, moving from a model of simple consequence to a model of direct, absolute causation. Section 2. The Ruler's Prison, the Earthly Analogy. Now, to explain how human defiance could possibly mandate the creation of an entire cosmic reality, the text introduces a very specific earthly analogy to ground this incredibly heavy theological concept. It sets the stage with three key elements. First, we have an insignificant ruler, and the text specifically notes he has only small dignity, small pride, and small majesty. Second, we have an unmannerly, impudent subject. And third, and honestly this is the most vital part of the whole setup, we have a scenario where no prison currently exists in that location. So the board is officially set. We have an authority figure, a defiant subject, and a total lack of existing punitive infrastructure. Now, what's really interesting about this scenario is the exact phrasing of the subject's defiance. This unmannerly person looks right at the ruler and says, "You may not punish me, and you cannot." This isn't just a generic crime, like stealing something or vandalism. No, it's a direct, vocal challenge to the ruler's actual capacity and authority. It is an explicit accusation of powerlessness. And this specific, highly defiant dialogue is exactly the offense that drives the rest of the text's logic. It is a complete affront to the very nature of the ruler's position, which brilliantly illustrates the logical conclusion of the text's analogy, because the subject didn't just break a random rule, but explicitly denied the ruler's fundamental ability to punish, while the ruler is left with absolutely no choice. Even if he didn't have a prison before, the text asserts that the ruler will certainly have a prison built for him and throw him into it. The sheer audacity of the subject literally forces the ruler's hand. The prison has to be created purely to physically disprove the subject's claim of the ruler's impotence. So in a very real way, the defiance built the prison. Section 3. An affront to infinite glory. The divine scale. All right, so let's do the math here and scale this earthly analogy all the way up to the divine reality. Our earthly analogy of an insignificant ruler maps directly onto a divine entity of infinite dignity, pride, and glory. The unmannerly person? That scales up to the unbeliever who denies hell. And that earthly prison we just talked about? That scales up to hell itself. The text is laying out a mathematical proportion for us. If a small affront to small dignity requires action, what in the world does an infinite affront to infinite dignity necessitate? Let's move on and see exactly how this builds into Nurse's chain of causality. It happens in 4 clear steps. Step 1. The unbeliever denies the existence of hell. According to the text's framework, this isn't just a casual difference of opinion. No, it immediately triggers step 2. By saying hell doesn't exist and I won't be punished, the unbeliever is actively accusing the divine of lying and impotence. This, of course, leads to step 3. This accusation terribly insults divine dignity and deeply offends his pride, which unavoidably brings us to step 4. Just like our earthly ruler, the divine is logically necessitated to create hell. The denial itself triggers the sequence of creation. And that brings us to the real climax of the text's argument. The source material states it absolutely definitively. If, to suppose the impossible, there were no reason for hell's existence, it would certainly be created for unbelief, which comprises denial and describing impotence to this degree. It is just a fascinating logical deduction. The text is arguing that the nature of this specific type of unbelief is so incredibly offensive because it directly calls an infinitely powerful being powerless, that this act alone would warrant the invention of a cosmic prison totally from scratch, even if one hadn't been planned. Section 4. A purposeful creation. Conclusion. The source actually concludes by quoting this Quranic verse, "Our sustainer, you did not create that in vain. Glory be unto you. Save us from the penalty of the fire." Within the context of our explainer today, we can see exactly why the author chose this specific verse. It perfectly summarizes all the preceding logic. The text has essentially spent its entirety proving that hell is not created in vain or without a reason. It's created with a profound, intensely logical purpose, as an absolutely unavoidable response to the denial of absolute power. The creation of the punishment is framed as a literal mathematical necessity of justice and dignity. Which brings us right to our final thought for today. Consider what we've mapped out from the 28th word. Is punishment just a consequence you stumble into, or is it a necessary creation born directly from the act of denial itself? By framing unbelief as a seed and denial as a direct challenge to infinite authority, the source material offers this highly structured, almost architectural view of cosmic justice. It's a truly compelling piece of logical mapping that fundamentally challenges how we view cause and effect in our own lives. Thank you so much for exploring this structural breakdown with me today.